Welcome, honor students. We're going to be doing our next online lecture here, where we're going to be covering three short story writers that I think you'll find very interesting. We'll begin with Dorothy Parker, and we're probably going to end up having to cut this into two separate videos, just because it takes a really long time to load up a long one. So be prepared for part one and a part two to follow this one, okay? In class, we talked a little bit about how the war, World War I that is, changed the American psyche, everything from modernism to a number of different sorts of things. And it ushered in the so-called American century, power, wealth, culture, concentrated in the United States of America, this up-and-coming, rising new power in the world, Europe having torn itself apart once and would tear itself apart a second time. The United States emerged relatively unscathed and quite prosperous after World War I. And it also led to a sort of a cultural revolution in some respects, not like the one in China, but a cultural revolution with respect to individuality, the growth of wealth, changing social mores and attitudes. Out were the Victorian values and systems of doing things, and in came a new world with a new sort of perspective. And this was, of course, nowhere seen more prominently than with women's rights, their status and their position changing, the 19th Amendment, as we talked about. And you got to see some rather exciting cultural changes if you lived at that time. Of course, you had automobiles, the radio for the first time. People could hear voices from across the continent. People could drive places they could never have gotten to on simply a horse or a horse and buggy, or it would have taken forever. We were flying. Airplanes were flying. It was remarkable, the kind of changes that were happening, as we said in class, beginning in that second and third decade of the century. You would see cinema icons, right? Film became incredibly popular. It was mostly silent film until about 1929, but people went to the cinema all the time, and it became an incredible cultural unifier, right? Everybody knew who the big movie stars were. Everybody saw the same movies. They listened to the same radio programs. So it had been a nation of basically different regions all over the place. We saw that with Chopin, who was interested in one particular region, right? So there were lots of different regions that were relatively culturally unconnected, or very tenuously connected. And it's in the 1920s that this begins to change, and we saw that somewhat with modernism. We'll see that here with Parker's Big Blonde. But Clara Bow, which is over there on the right, down here, if you would, and Louise Brooks here were fashion icons of the time, but they were also symbols of the new young woman, the woman question that everybody had in mind. What was happening to our daughters? My gosh, look at how they're dressing. You can see their ankles down here. They're flappers dressing around. By the way, flappers never wore this fringy stuff. That's not what they wore. This girl right here is a flapper, but they weren't big on the fringe thing. But the short skirts and the bobbed hair, the kind of boyish hairdos, and that kind of the low-waisted, flat-chested outfits. I mean, these were very typical of the 1920s. I got a picture somewhere of my grandmother wearing something like one of these girls right here was wearing. They started smoking, and some of them actually drank alcohol, which is, during Prohibition, not a great thing to do, right? These changes were on the minds of a lot of people, and you had some women who were also making forays into intellectual circles. Now here is, over in this bottom right-hand corner over here, this is what is frequently called the Algonquin Club, if you will. They're a group of writers, journalists mostly, writing for magazines and newspapers. And you'll notice there's only one female down there, and that's Dorothy Parker herself, and she's going to be the subject of our next short story. In fact, we'll go on over to that slide right now. Dorothy Parker, an amazing person, sad person, but an amazing person. I had to put all these up here because she's really very famous for her one-liners. As a poet, as a short story writer, but also as a journalist. Her life ended sadly. She had a lot of really bad relationships. We said in class that she had attempted suicide a number of times. She was a severe alcoholic, and died of a heart attack at I think in her early 60s, I believe. In any event, or maybe she was in her 70s, I don't recall. She was known for her great one-liners. I'm going to read a few of these. Some of these can't be read in public without blushing. Some of them are even more racy than some of these. But she was a quick-witted person who could really rattle off a one-liner that made you think, and I like people like that. She once said about a novel that she was reviewing, she said, "This is not a novel to be tossed aside lightly. It should be thrown with great force." Throw that thing out the window. This is horrible. When she was asked to use the word horticulture in a sentence, she replied, "You can lead a horticulture, but you can't make her think." Okay, that's pretty racy, right? I thought that was pretty good. You figured it out if you didn't already. She says in another quote, "It's a small apartment. I've barely had enough room to lay a hat and a few friends." Oh my. Okay, deal with that as you will. "I require 3 things in a man. He must be handsome, ruthless, and stupid." She liked dumb men. Tell me why? I don't know. She's very famous for some one-liners. I think one of the ones that she has been attributed to her is, "Beauty is only skin deep, but ugly is to the bone." She's the one who came up with that one, we think, anyway. She said the cure for boredom is curiosity. There is no cure for curiosity. That's a pretty uplifting one, kind of interesting there. And of course, she was very ironic, very sardonic in her writing, especially. She said, "If you have any young friends who aspire to become writers, the second greatest favor you can do for them is present them with copies of The Elements of Style," which is a style book. "The first greatest, of course, is to shoot them now while they're happy," right? Because writers will never be happy. So do them a favor, shoot them, kill them now, or they're going to have a life of misery. And she says, sadly but true, she says, "I'm not a writer with a drinking problem. I'm a drinker with a writing problem." Dark humor was her thing. And it's sad, but you couldn't help but kind of laugh a little bit in this. So she's dealing with this, in this story, with a profile, if you will, of the modern woman of the 1920s. Their status is changing. We said earlier, I don't know why I repeated all this, there was a real woman question. We're going to look here very closely at Hazel Morse and banality. Life is a sort of series of meaningless experiences for her. But what I want you to do, so let's talk a little bit about Hazel. Hazel is a young woman. She is working, I think, in a department store is what I recall. And she meets Herbie. And Herbie and she like to go out and have fun and party. And she's kind of what in the 1920s they would have called, get this word, a flibberty-gibbet. Now, people say, what in the world? That was kind of a craze fad term at the time. Flibberty-gibbet. A flibberty-gibbet means kind of a flighty girl, one that's not too serious, who kind of is a little bit of a bubblehead, but more of a person who just likes to have a good time and is kind of superficial. And that's kind of the way she knocked about when she was young. She didn't have a lot of guidance as a young woman. Now, here's where I want us to go with this short story, because I think this is what one of the things that Parker's trying to say. You have a whole new generation of young women who have considerable freedom compared to their mothers and grandmothers, right? They can do what they want. They can go into certain careers if they want. They can live the lives that they want to, for the most part, without as much of a tight sort of lid on their behavior as previously. I mean, by today's standards, you would have thought it was just suffocating. But by their standards, by their parents' standards and grandparents' standards, it was, these young women are running wild, doing whatever they want to, you see. The problem I think you're presented with in Big Blonde is, what does that generation of women do with all that freedom and all those choices? Because they've been given that, or they've taken that freedom, but there's no model for how to live one's life with that freedom. And there's no path, there's no recipe, there's no menu here. They don't know, there's no instruction book on how to live a meaningful, productive life, partly because you're kind of got one foot in freedom and one foot in conventionality in the past, as Hazel does, right? There are things that you can do now as a young woman, and there are things that you still can't do, right? They don't have the freedom of a man. So what you're presented with Hazel, she starts with the relationship with Herbie. That clearly does not work out. He's an alcoholic. She wasn't initially an alcoholic, becomes one. Was not always perhaps the most upright and prudish kind of person, but certainly when she met Herbie, she had every intention, I think, in the early in the relationship, to remain faithful and monogamous. That goes by the wayside when she meets old Ed over there across the hall at Mrs. Martin's, and Mrs. Martin sort of is this neighbor who sets up shop, and they have card games and they drink a lot all the time, and it's party central. Okay, every apartment complex has a party central. If it's not your place, it's somebody else's. And so Mrs. Martin runs that, and Hazel begins to just hang out over there, and experiences, as you can see throughout the short story, this succession of men who go in and out of her life, most of whom she does not have any really deep feeling for at all. She might have a fondness for them, but she really doesn't have a deep feeling for them at all. This kind of starts at the beginning of the short story on page 617 when she says, this is early, she says, men liked her, and she took it for granted that the liking of many men was a desirable thing. Popularity seemed to her to be worth all the work that had to be put into its achievement. Men liked you because you were fun. And when they liked you, they took you out. And there you were. She hadn't thought about it any more than that. Why do you want to go out with men? I don't know. Because because you're supposed to, right? I need to be nice and flirty and fun with men so that they'll take me out. And if they take you out, well, then that's the goal, right? Isn't it? Kind of, sort of, in life. Do you see? So she's a young woman who has choices and freedoms and more independence than maybe her mother or her grandmother. But she doesn't have a roadmap for how to manage that freedom. She doesn't know what she wants to do with her life. She actually doesn't have anything she does want to do with her life. Life just kind of happens to her. She doesn't have any religious convictions, no philosophical convictions at all, right? She never even thinks about, her life or the afterlife or how to live properly or anything. She just takes it day after day after day. And there's this slow downward spiral. After Herbie, of course, there's Ed. After Ed, there is, oh gosh, who's next? It's not Sydney next. There's another fella, Charlie. That's who it is, Charlie. And then Sydney, then Bill, and so on and so forth. And then it's just, it's a blur to her who her next dude is. And she even says some things in the text which kind of make you go, gosh, that's just terrible. She says at one point, she never thought of, I'm sorry, that's her husband. She says, she accepted her relationship with Ed without question or enthusiasm. Right? Oh, that's really? When Ed leaves, she said she did not miss him. She did not miss him. She was glad to see him, but indifferent when he left. And that's the case with all of her really transient relationships. So when I talk about Hazel Morse and banality, the banality of life, the meaninglessness of it, the boringness of it, life is just this series of meaningless experiences because she doesn't have a life code. She doesn't have a life plan. She doesn't have specific aspirations. She doesn't have a view on what life means or should mean, right? I don't think she has a definition of happiness. She doesn't have one. So she's really sort of both morally, spiritually, physically, intellectually adrift. And I think that's one of the things that Parker wants to demonstrate in here is that with that freedom comes essentially, existential anarchy, if you will. How would you describe her attitude towards men? It's very hard to describe, although it's very simple at the same time. Because on the one hand, she uses them. They use her. She doesn't have a dislike of men. She just isn't terribly infatuated with them. They are a means to an end, and she does enjoy the company of them. It's not as though she hangs out with them against her will. She doesn't do that. It's just that, one guy's as good as another. It's just about tonight. It's just about getting drunk and having a good time. And because if you don't get drunk and have a good time, there isn't anything else to your life. That's where she is on this, right? She goes on and very sadly, she begins to become suicidal. Of course, Parker was as well. And decides to take this substance called Veronal, which in small doses is a sleeping medication, in somewhat bigger doses will do you in, and tries to do herself in, and does not succeed, just like Parker a couple of times. She does not succeed in doing it. And it's very sad because towards the end, the maid comes in. By the way, this was written in 1929. People use different language to describe different people of different ethnicities. we don't use those terms anymore, but at the same time, she's just a product of her era. So do with that as you will. At the end, when she gets revived and revitalized from the overdose of the medication, the narrator indicates to us that it's a very open-ended. We don't know what's going to happen to Hazel. We don't at the end. It's quite an open-ended piece. Maybe whiskey would be her friend again. She prayed without addressing a God, without knowing a God. Oh, please, please let me be able to get drunk. Please keep her always drunk. Here's the problem with drinkers, like heavy drinkers. They build up an alcohol tolerance. It's the same thing with drugs, is that you can get to a point as a heavy drinker that if you drink a lot, you can't get drunk from it. Or it's very difficult to get drunk from it without drinking a whole lot, which is, of course, how people get alcohol poisoning and stuff. But there are a lot of people who, if they've been drinking a long time and a lot, that they can sit down and polish off, half a bottle or more of whiskey or something like that, and they're not even the least bit drunk. And so she's been drinking so much for so long, she can't even get drunk anymore. Which is weird, but it's true. It's how people OD on drugs, by the way. Cocaine or meth or something like that. It takes a lot to get you high, and if you take too much, it'll kill you. She lifted the glass. Thanks, Nettie. Here's mud in your eye. The maid giggled. That's the way, Miss Morse. You cheer up now. Yeah, said Mrs. Morris. Sure. And that's the end of the story. And you might say, well, that's very disappointing. I want to know what happened to her. You're not going to know what happened to her. Parker doesn't want you to know what happened to her. I think it's somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat semi-autobiographical. Don't read too much into it. Parker certainly wasn't some big buxom blonde by any means, but she did have a series of relationships that just never did work out, and had a lot of problems with drinking, of course, but she was just quite a brilliant person, unlike Hazel, who wasn't terribly educated or wasn't very well read. So there's a lot of differences there. But I think she's trying to take a look at this new type of young woman. And I don't think this is a morality tale. I don't think it's a cautionary tale. I think it's just a portrait that is trying to tell you this is what happens when people are adrift and have no moorings and don't know what to do with their lives. And when they're given lots of choice. Yeah, somebody else could look at this and look at it very differently, but this is the way I read it. And I could be wrong, but I think that what you're presented with, undoubtedly and indubitably, with Hazel is someone who has considerably greater freedom, but doesn't know what to do with her life. We have not, as a society, prepared her for the choices she's going to be given. And that can be disastrous. And we have also told her that she has choices in some directions, but no options in others, which is conflicting and difficult. So she has freedom to choose, but she's still heavily dependent on men for income and support and all these things. So it's kind of this strange kind of quasi freedom, if you will. Well, let's take a look at the next short story, which really is not a modernist short story at all. It's a very strange, more contemporary short story. And I want to look at the issue of identity in Maxine Hong Kingston's On Discovery. It's a strange story. It's basically got 2 parts, 3 sections, 2 parts, and it comes from a text called Chinamen, which is kind of this mix of myth, narrative, and autobiography. She's a very curious, very interesting writer here, and I want us to take a peek at that. So if you'll get it out, we'll take a close look at it. It's a kind of a mythical part 1 with Tang Ao, who comes across the land of the women. She kind of gives it this sort of semi-historical, faux historical. Oh, it was back in this period, that period, the other, the Wu Empress Wu. I have no idea. Essentially no such. She's just kind of making this up from what I can tell. But they feminize him. Okay, quite clearly they feminize him. They completely, subdue him, enslave him, feminize him, and he has to deal with this question of his own emasculation. And then it just stops, and you just say, okay, well, what was that all about? I think you have to look then at the second part here. The first one is myth. The second part here, which reads very clearly, in the women's land, there are no taxes and no wars. Some scholars say that the country was discovered during the reign of Empress Wu, AD 694 to 705, and some say earlier than that, AD 441. and it was in North America. Okay, that's just kind of random and out of the blue. And some people say it was in China. Some people say no, it was in North America, and some people say it was in. Where does that come from? But there's kind of a theme or thesis there. Okay, that seems to be offered up. And then the third part is autobiographical. Okay, the third part is she tells this story about her grandfather, who was really kind of nutty. Okay, everybody has a crazy relative. Grandpa was nutty, and he went and traded her father for a girl in the neighborhood. He just swapped him out. You want this boy? I'll swap you for your daughter. And just swapped him out because he always wanted a girl. He was just like, woohoo. And so there are stories that my grandfather was different from other people. Well, yeah, duh. There's nothing weird like he was like a child molester or anything like that. Okay, that's the first thing people think is, he's going out to find some little girl to, but nothing like that. He just was kind of goofy and nutty in the head. And one day he brought home a baby girl wrapped up inside his brown Western style greatcoat. He had traded one of his sons, probably my father. My grandfather made him trade back. Go take this child back and bring back my son. What are you, crazy? Okay. When he finally got a daughter of his own, he doted on her. They must have all loved her, except perhaps my father, the only brother who never went back to China, having once been traded for a girl. He goes, oh, okay. This my sister, yeah, I got traded for a girl. That's how much they wanted me. But now look. First you think is, what in the world does this have to do with the Tang Ao who got feminized and foot binding? You know that foot binding was a practice. You can see that down there at the bottom right. Foot binding was a practice among the royalty in China, that they did to young women, princesses. And the reason was they basically infantilized their feet. And they broke bones, and they crushed their feet and put them in these little tiny slippers. And their feet would grow no bigger than the slipper because they were forced to wear them. That was so that they could be carried around everywhere, that they would not walk. They didn't want them to walk. They wanted them to be waited on all the time by servants. And so if you were one of these princesses, you didn't have to walk. Imagine the cardiovascular disease problems these women had, never getting any aerobic exercise by a good stiff walk in the countryside, but be that as it may. It was considered a height of beauty and refinement, and you were upper class if you had your feet bound. You were considered dainty and all this kind of stuff. It's just kind of a weird thing. And they do this to Tang Ao, and they do all these other things. They paint his face, and they make him up, and all these kinds of things. And they totally feminize him. So what in the world is the point of the myth? And what is its relationship to the second section? And then the harder question, I think, is what's its relation to the third section? Because clearly there you have this discussion of femininity. And she goes on in the last paragraph of the text and says, the immigrants I know have loud voices, unmodulated to American tones, even after years away from the village where they call their friendships out across the fields. In other words, my family's from China, and all the people who are brand new to America that come over here have loud voices because they're used to shouting at each other across the fields, right? I have not been able to stop my mother's screams in public libraries or over telephones, right? Hey, hand me that book over there. It's like, what are you doing? In America, we don't yell in libraries. Walking erect, knees straight, toes pointed forward, not pigeon-toed, which is Chinese feminine, and speaking in an inaudible voice. I have tried to turn myself American feminine. Now here, I think we're getting close here. What's going on? She is from a culture where femininity is expressed differently than in America, where femininity is expressed in a kind of westernized style. How does she describe that? She says, I tried not to be Chinese feminine, but I'm trying to be American feminine in everything I do. What are the things that she does? She says she walks upright rather than kind of hunched over, right? Knees straight, toes pointed forward, not pigeon-toed. Pigeon-toed is when you're if I can get this on camera, where your toes are pointed in towards each other, okay? And they shuffle. You have to shuffle when that happens, which is Chinese feminine, and speaking in an inaudible voice, okay? Lower voice, erect, straight, but lower voice. Okay, so she's and by the way, if you're from an immigrant family, this story, and especially the next one, really resonates with a lot of immigrant students, because they say, I feel like I'm kind of pulled between two cultures. You know, my parents or my grandparents are from another country, and here I am an American, but I feel connected to my past and my family. I love my past, I love my culture, I love my family, but there's this double set of expectations that pull me, and that's kind of the American story of every. If you feel that way, every American that's immigrated, every American throughout the history of this country that's immigrated here has felt that way. So you're not alone. It's just that if all of your friends and their family members grew up in the country, they don't understand. Okay, I don't understand because my family's lived here for centuries. But I've taught enough students who tell me that I begin to say, oh, I see. I kind of understand what you're saying, even though I've never lived it. I think I understand what you're saying, and so she's trying to get at that right quick. She says, I've tried to turn myself American feminine. Chinese communication was loud, public. Only sick people had to whisper. But at the dinner table, where the family members came nearest one another, no one could talk. Not the outcasts, nor any eaters. Every word that falls from the mouth is a coin lost. In other words, we were loud people, but at the dinner table, we don't say anything, right? Why is that? You'll see. Every word that falls from the mouth. When you talk at the table, every word is like losing money, right? You don't do that. Silently, they gave and accepted food with both hands, right? You hand it to somebody, you take it with both hands, right? A preoccupied child who took his bowl with one hand got a sideways glance. Boy, don't pick up that bowl with one hand. Why? Food was precious. Food was very precious, especially to poor peasant families in rural China in the early 20th century, when there was mass starvation, when the communists came in and the Civil War was happening. Millions of people died of starvation. So it's like, not in this family. You don't say a word, you don't spill a drop. Food is holy. Okay, right? I mean, it's precious and holy. So you don't. So she's trying to show this difference between cultures. And here she is as a child trying to hang on to the culture she belongs to and appreciate and value it, obviously, and make fun of it too. Everybody's family's got funny stuff. Okay. But she's also saying, I have to navigate and live in this culture, and I also feel like I've got a foot in this culture, and I'm really torn sometimes between the two. A complete moment of total attention is due everyone alike. Children and lovers have no singularity here, but my aunt used a secret voice, a separate attentiveness. Right? So what is the tie here between the experience of Tang Ao and that myth and then her own situation? I think it is that we walk into expectations either about gender, identity, femininity, masculinity, whatever it is, with certain preconceived notions and certain attitudes about it. And then those attitudes tend to run smack into our lived experiences. And it's more complicated than that, because we have to, on the one hand, be authentic to ourselves, but on the other hand, which means being authentic to where we came from, but then also we have to function in this whole new world with new rules about what constitutes femininity or masculinity or identity or gender or whatever. And I think the relationship between part 1 and part 3 is somehow an attempt to say, and again, she says, I'm drawing on cultural myth from my people's past, right? That storytelling. And I'm trying to apply it to my present or my past and try to make sense of it. It also seems to raise the question of, is femininity culturally dependent, or masculinity as well, for that matter? Clearly, in some respects, it is. I will tell you that when we go to certain places in Europe, I've been going with honor students for over 2 decades now, to Europe every January. I'm not going this January. I didn't get to go last January, but I hope to do it again. Every time we do, and we go to Southern Europe, it's a very eye-opening experience for a lot of young women and young men from the United States, because depending on where you are in Spain or Portugal or Greece or Italy in particular, talking about Southern Europe, one of the first things students notice is that, gosh, the women are like half a notch more feminine, and the men are half a notch more masculine. And I just say, well, okay, I mean, work that out on your own. But I too have noticed that a lot of people in Southern Europe, there's more of a difference between the genders and their behaviors. And this is not culturally enforced. It's not unusual to go out in public and see women who dress in a very sort of, I won't say provocative, I don't say that, very feminine way. They're very kind of proud of their femininity, and men are proud of their masculinity, and there's a little bit more of a difference. And the criticism of a lot of Southern Europeans is that your women dress like men. They dress frumpy. They're wearing like baggy pants and guys' t-shirts and whatnot. And in Italy, where they're very fashion conscious, no woman out in public would wear something that made her look like a dude, no matter how casual. They would never wear warm-ups. Oh my gosh, I can't imagine a woman in Milan wearing warm-ups out in public. They would just, what in the world are you wearing? They wear fairly form-fitting outfits. Their attitude is, if you got it, show it. And that's true with the dudes, too. And it just is different. Culturally, it's just kind of different. In the U.S., the criticism, I think, a lot is that the men are kind of metrosexual and the women are too manly. And there's just not enough difference. In Spain, especially, they say, there's not enough difference in the way men and women dress in the United States. They all dress the same. It's all unisex. And they just like, I mean, women there like to be very feminine looking, and men like to be very masculine looking. Not everybody, obviously, but a lot of them do. And so those differences are quite a bit more pronounced and obvious, is what I'm getting at. So is there a difference between femininity and masculinity? Is there some cultural dependence there? I think she's making a point about that. I'm not exactly sure what the point is, but I think I know where she's going with it. Anyway, okay, stay tuned for part 2. Get that before you, and you'll be able to watch that right after this one, okay?